Imagine this. Your bread just came out of the oven and it smells absolutely delicious. You consider cutting into it, but then you remember all of the people on the internet telling you to never cut your bread early because it'll dry out quickly. So that's why I cut my bread right out of the oven to see what happens. This is going to be dry. Well, not like that. Hi, I'm Sune, and I'm not just a food enthusiast, I'm a full-blown food geek. I'm here to share my passion and knowledge with you. I've honestly put off today's experiment for a long time because I thought it was kind of silly. Obviously, a loaf cut while it was warm would dry out faster. But never mind, I'm doing it, destroying my bread for answers we're all looking for. I plan to conduct this experiment by cutting one loaf of bread right out of the oven, one after half an hour of resting, one after the bread has cooled down completely, and one after 24 hours. After cutting the last bread, I will evaluate each loaf's texture, taste, and perceived dryness. For this experiment, I'm using my standard experiment dough, which is 80% bread flour, 20% rye flour, 20% sourdough starter, 2% salt, and 80% hydration. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon. You can also buy some merch, or use the super thanks, or use the links for tools and ingredients in the description. Those were the words. This is the experiment. This is an experiment, not a recipe. My master recipe for sourdough bread is linked in the description. Alright, let me zoom through the bread making process. I made one giant dough so that every loaf is the same. First, I mixed all of the dry ingredients. Then I added the starter and water. I made sure the dough was worked entirely through. Lastly, I let the dough rest for an hour. When the dough was rested, I sprayed a bulking container with baking spray, added the dough, leveled the top, and put the dough in the proofer until it was fermented. When the dough had fermented, I split it into 4 equally sized pieces. Then I pre-shaped each loaf. And let them rest for 20 minutes. And final shaped each loaf. I was a bit sloppy on the day, which you'll see later in the crumb. Then I rest them in the fridge for a couple of hours. I heated my oven to 230 degrees Celsius, 450 degrees Fahrenheit. And then I grabbed the first loaf, dusted the bottom with rice flour, flipped it onto the peel, scored it, and then I baked it. After about 25 minutes, I prepared the second loaf. Moved the first loaf out of the Dutch oven and baked the second loaf. Then after 25 minutes, I prepared the third loaf. Grab the loaf that would be the one cut after it cooled down and let it cool down on a wire rack. Then I baked the third loaf. I prepared the last loaf. I grabbed the loaf that would wait until the next day and put it on a wire rack to cool. Then I baked the last loaf. And I cooled down the one that would wait 30 minutes, and then the one that I would cut right away. Which I did. Don't mind the crumb, it won't affect the test. Look at all that steam escaping the loaf. Only 5 minutes later, I cut the third loaf. Each loaf rests open for 15 minutes, then rests cut side down until the comparison. After about 2 hours, the first loaf was cooled down and I cut it. Then the next day I cut the second loaf that had rested since it was baked. I left it to rest 15 minutes, and while I did that, I cut off a slice of each of the other loaves to ensure that I wasn't comparing the cut part that may have dried out a little bit. Alright, let's look at the 4 loaves. First, the one that was cut right out of the oven. It smells delicious. Crunchy. The crumb seems nice and moist. The one that waited 30 minutes seems precisely the same. This is a pattern. There are no differences in the last 2 loaves. Alright, let's have a look at slices, and I'll put my bread where my mouth is, so to speak. I roll the dough between 2 fingers to see how moist it is. It makes a nice little dough ball. It's not dry at all. The taste is delicious, and it certainly seems nice and moist. Surprisingly, the 3 other loaves are precisely the same. I couldn't tell them apart if I hadn't cut them myself. Well, actually labeled them. Okay, off to the conclusion. So after the initial test, I kept eating the bread. It was stored the same way, and all the loaves were uncomfortably dry after 4 days. There were no perceived differences in taste or texture, so this myth is busted. You can cut your bread whenever you like. If anybody tells you otherwise, point them to this video. Were you as surprised as I was? Let me know in the comments. I hope you learned something today. See you next time.